macOS 26 Tahoe has been revealed by Apple, and the good news, it's still supporting Intel Macs. It's not an Apple Silicon macOS only. The bad news is that the list of officially supported Intel Macs is unacceptable in my opinion and raises the question immediately, how good are the chances for unsupported Intel Macs to run macOS 26 Tahoe when it will be released in fall? Welcome to Jesse's Flying. Apple just revealed macOS 26 Tahoe on the WWDC. And yes, it still supports Intel Macs. The big fear we all had was that Apple might switch to a Apple Silicon only macOS this year. They didn't. That's the good news. The bad news, they just announced at the WWDC they will do that next year. So macOS Tahoe will be the final and last macOS supporting Intel Macs. And obviously that's the reason why the list of officially supported Intel Macs really got quite short and quite complicated and quite not understandable. Because I went through all the Mac models supported officially and dropped from macOS Sequoia to Tahoe, and that doesn't make any sense. Even though some models have the same hardware, the one is supported, the other is not. And so I'd like to show you that overview, and when we start comparing the hardware, we might get some clues if and how well the developers of OpenCore and the OpenCore legacy patcher might be able to enable macOS Tahoe when it will be released in fall on all these unsupported Macs, and how good are the chances for your unsupported Mac. Let's go. Last year, in the transition from macOS Sonoma to macOS Sequoia, there was only one Mac model that was officially not supported anymore by Apple, and that was the MacBook Air 2018-2019. Unfortunately, up until now, the developers of the OpenCore and OpenCore legacy patcher were not able to enable macOS Sequoia on that MacBook Air, but we'll talk about that later in the video. This year, in the transition from macOS Sequoia to macOS Tahoe, it looks a little bit different. So let's start with the iMac. Last year with macOS Sequoia, it was still supported 2019 and later, while this year it's 2020 and later, but still the Intel version. The Mac Studio was always Apple Silicon, and obviously this is still officially supported, but this is not an Intel Mac, so let's cross that out. The Mac Mini is the big loser because with macOS Sequoia, the Mac Mini 2018 was still supported, and with macOS Tahoe, the Mac Mini with Apple Silicon from 2020 is supported. So no Intel Mac Mini anymore. Good news for all the guys who spent a lot of money on the Mac Pro 2019. This is still officially supported. That's also Intel based. The iMac Pro from 2017 is not supported anymore. The MacBook Air 2020 Intel version that was supported with macOS Sequoia is not supported anymore. It's only the MacBook Air with Apple Silicon from 2020, so no Intel MacBook Air anymore. And now it comes to the MacBook Pro, and that was supported 2018 and later, and this year it's 2019 16-inch. And the 16-inch MacBook Pro always had 4 Thunderbolt ports, but I added that here just to have a complete overview. But Apple only mentions the 16-inch MacBook Pro 2019. Yes, there are also MacBook Pros that were released in 2020, 16-inch, but the model name and year is still 2019. I have one of that MacBook Pros here. It's still called 2019. The next thing that is officially supported is the MacBook Pro 13-inch 2020 with 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. There have been MacBook Pros in 2019 and 2020 13-inch that only had 2 Thunderbolt ports. And obviously the MacBook Pro with Apple Silicon is supported because that's the latest version from M1 up to M4. But as Apple only speaks about the 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro, that means the 15-inch 2019 MacBook Pro is not officially supported anymore. And we'll talk about that and the hardware specifications in a few minutes in the video. And what also is not supported anymore is the MacBook Pro 2019 and 2020 with 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, because Apple explicitly says it's the 13-inch 2020 MacBook Pro with 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports. So what does that mean in detail? The Mac Pro 2019, the Intel Mac Pro, is still officially supported. The iMac Pro 2017 is not supported anymore. This one has an Intel Xeon processor up to 18 cores and 36 threads, but that is based on the Skylake architecture from Intel. It has a quite new graphics card. It's Graphics Core Next 5 Vega family, and it has the T2 security chip. Why that is important, we'll talk about in a minute. But to get an idea about all these CPU generations and why that list is so weird, let me give you a short overview about all the Intel chip generations. So the Intel Core generation, the first generation was the Nehalem family that was introduced in 2008. And that went into the first Mac Pro cheese grater. Then there was the Westmere update in 2010, still first generation. Then there was the second generation Sandy Bridge in 2011. And then there was 2012 Ivy Bridge third generation. And there was the Intel Xeon generation for the Mac Pro 2013 trash can. Then in 2013, Intel introduced the Haswell 4th generation that had Intel AVX2 instruction set that is required for macOS Ventura and later. And therefore, the trash can was not officially supported beyond macOS Monterey. So after the 4th generation of Haswell, there was the 5th generation Broadwell in 2015 and the 6th generation, that was mid-2015, Skylake. From that 6th generation, the iMac Pro got its Xeon processor. The Xeon is from 2017 like the iMac Pro, but the architecture is still Skylake based, and that is from 2015. And after the 6th generation, there was the 7th generation Kaby Lake, the 8th and 9th generation Coffee Lake. And from the 9th generation, the Mac Pro 2019 got its Xeon processors. They were called Cascade Lake, but they are based on the architecture of the 9th generation Coffee Lake processors. And then there was the 10th generation Comet Lake, and that was the last Intel generation Apple used in any Mac. And so to have an idea, Apple just cut all Macs 2017 and older in macOS Sequoia, which basically means it only supported 8th, 9th and 10th generation of Intel chips. The only exemption was the iMac Pro, because it was basically from 2017, but the Xeon processors, which were also from 2017, were based on an architecture from 2015. But obviously it worked. And this year, Apple just pushed that boundary 1 year further. So for macOS Tahoe, they cut all Intel Macs that are older than the 9th and 10th generation. So basically they dropped all the 8th generation Intel Macs. So far so good. Let's just go through the Mac models and I will show you it's getting weirder and weirder. Before we do that, maybe there's another reason for Apple dropping some Intel Mac models, because all of them, or many of them, have a dedicated graphics card. Mac Pros, obviously, the iMacs, obviously, the MacBook Pros, most of them. And just a short overview, what kind of graphic cards Apple used in that Intel Macs. And they used graphics Core Next Generation 4 and 5. For instance, the Radeon RX 580 that is in my Mac Pro 2012 is a GCN 4th generation Polaris family. The 5th generation is the Vega family, that is the Vega 56, Vega 64. They also used Vega 12, Vega 20 and so on. And they used the RDNA 1st generation, and that is the Radeon 5300, 5500, 5600, 5700, something like that. And they were called Navi family. Just to have an idea when you see the next slides. So starting with the Mac Mini, there is no Intel Mac Mini officially supported with macOS Tahoe. The last one was the 2018 Mac Mini, and that has obviously an 8th generation Intel chip. As Apple dropped the 8th generation, this Mac Mini had to go. So far so good. Next, the 2019 iMac. Most of the models had also an 8th generation Intel chip. Some had a 9th generation Intel chip, but I can understand that if you have a model year and most of the iMacs are 8th generation, that you skip just the complete model year and you don't do any differences between 8th and 9th CPU generations. Fine with that. So they skipped and dropped the iMac 2019. One interesting factor is that the iMac 2019 doesn't have a security chip. So what is the security chip? Apple introduced the T1 security chip in the MacBook Pros 2016. And that was used for the touch bar and the Touch ID, the fingerprint sensor that stores the fingerprints in an encrypted way, and it needed a security chip to be able to unlock the MacBook Pro and to make payments via Touch ID and so on. But that were only with the MacBook Pro 2016 and 17. Then they switched already to the T2 chip. And this is more or less in all Intel Macs, and with the Apple Silicon that is integrated into the Apple Silicon chip. So they don't need a dedicated chip for that. So if you have Touch ID, Face ID, whatever ID, wallet and so on, there's a lot of stuff that the T2 chip handles. But this iMac doesn't have any. Might be a reason why Apple dropped it. No, because when we switch to the 2020 iMac, you can see that is 10th generation Intel chip, but only the 27-inch does have the T2 chip if you get the 21.5-inch iMac 2020. There were some variants that came with an SSD storage that also had the T2 chip. But there were also some models that came with a Fusion drive. Fusion drive is a quite old invention where you have a small SSD for the most common files and you have a large spinning hard disk for storage. And so with the combined speed of that could get quite fast, but you have cheap storage because you have a big spinning hard disk that's quite cheap. You don't need that big SSDs. If you happen to have a 2020 iMac 21.5 inches with a Fusion drive, you don't have a security chip. There's no T1 or T2 chip in that. And as this is officially supported by macOS Tahoe, that cannot be a reason for skipping and dropping other Mac models. It's getting weirder. Let's go on. So talking about the MacBook Pros, and now it gets a little bit complicated. The easy part, the MacBook Pro 2018 has an 8th generation Intel chip that is dropped. The 2019 13-inch MacBook Pro with 2 Thunderbolt ports is also officially dropped. Why? Because it also has an 8th generation Intel chip, even though it's 2019 MacBook Pro. And the best thing is that the 2020 13-inch 2 Thunderbolt port MacBook Pro has the same hardware and still an 8th generation Intel chip. That is really a bad catch. If you buy a MacBook Pro in 2020 and you get a more than 2-year-old 8th generation Intel chip with integrated graphics that's also 2 years old, and now some 2019 MacBook Pros are officially supported with macOS Tahoe, but your 2020 MacBook Pro is not. I don't get it, Apple. What also is not supported, because it's not mentioned on Apple's website, is the 15-inch 2019 MacBook Pro, even though it has 4 Thunderbolt ports. But the 15-inch MacBook Pro was released in the beginning of 2019, while mid-2019 they introduced the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and that is officially supported for macOS Tahoe. And the funny thing is, if I go back one slide, both have a 9th generation Intel CPU, same CPU. The only difference is that 2019 MacBook Pro has an RDNA 1 Navi graphics card, while the 15-inch still has a graphics core next to GCN 5th generation Vega or 4th generation graphics card. I don't know why Apple is not supporting the 15-inch 2019 MacBook Pro anymore. In my opinion, there's no reason. Same CPU, both have the T2 security chip, which is not a reason, as we already learned with the iMac, just a newer graphics card. What also is supported is the 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro with 4 Thunderbolt ports. What also was dropped is the 2020 MacBook Air, the Intel version. And I don't know why. Because it has a 10th generation Intel chip. And as we saw, Apple basically supports 9th and 10th generation in other Macs, but not with the MacBook Air. When we go to the overview, what models were dropped, we lost the 2017 iMac Pro. Okay, Xeon Skylake architecture, 6th generation, quite old. The Mac Mini 2018, 8th generation Intel chip, okay, it's gone. The iMac 2019, most of it is 8th generation Intel chip, some 9th generation, but it's one model year. Go for it, fine. The 2018 MacBook Pro, 8th generation Intel chip, makes sense. The 13-inch 2 Thunderbolt port versions of the MacBook Pro 2019-2020, all of them have an 8th generation Intel chip, makes sense. What doesn't make a sense is the 2019 15-inch MacBook Pro, because that has the same hardware, 9th generation Intel chip, and quite modern graphics card as the 16-inch that is officially supported. That I really cannot understand, Apple. And what I cannot understand either is the 2020 MacBook Air with a 10th generation Intel chip. So let's have an outlook. When we see all that hardware, how difficult might it be for the developers of OpenCore and OpenCore Legacy Patcher to enable these hardware, these Macs, to run macOS Tahoe? let's have a look at the supported models. The 2020 iMac 10th generation CPU, fine. The 2019 Mac Pro Xeon based on 9th generation Intel chip, okay. The 2019 and 2020 16-inch MacBook Pro that has a 9th generation Intel chip, and the 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro with 4 Thunderbolt ports that has a 10th generation Intel chip. If you do some research, there are no big hardware changes, no big differences from 6th to 7th to 8th to 9th to 10th Intel generations. Not like, as you saw, from 3rd to 4th generation to the Haswell generation where they introduced AVX2, which Apple uses for Ventura. So all Macs without AVX2 cannot run Ventura without OpenCore. And let's have a look at the graphic cards. You can see the official supported Macs use RDNA 1 Navi, GCN 4 Polaris and GCN 5 Vega graphic cards. And when we go back to the other page, you can see that a lot of the officially dropped models also use GCN 4 and 5. So when there are officially supported models, the drivers are still there in macOS Tahoe. So no reason here for dropping these models. The officially supported iMac 2020 doesn't have a T2 chip. So all these drop models have a T2 chip. So no reason for that. And so that looks a little bit like just moving forward year by year, disregarding hardware differences and if that is required by macOS to drop that hardware. So how does that look for the OpenCore legacy patcher, OpenCore community and the unsupported Macs? In my opinion, this looks very, very promising because I don't find any hardware features that macOS Tahoe requires besides when you're using Apple Intelligence. You obviously need an Apple Silicon chip because Apple Intelligence won't run on these Intel Macs, the officially supported ones. You need an Apple Silicon with a neural engine. But that's fine, it's just disabled on the Intel Macs, and I don't see any hardware features that are really required, like the AVX2 thing that would prevent OpenCore and OpenCore Legacy Patcher to enable those unsupported Macs with macOS Tahoe when it will be released. But that's the final chapter of this video. The MacBook Air 2018, the MacBook Air 8.1 or 8.2, that was dropped from macOS Sonoma to Sequoia. So Sonoma is the latest official macOS. Has not yet been enabled for macOS Sequoia because the developers of OpenCore and the OpenCore Legacy Patcher could not enable that MacBook Air model to run macOS Sequoia after a 3/4 of a year. Why? The reason is the security chip, the T2 security chip. It has a T2 security chip, and as we saw, macOS Sequoia supports a lot of Intel Macs with a T2 security chip. But with that model, there were always kernel panics and they couldn't get it to run properly in macOS Sequoia. And so as all other dropped Intel Mac models do have a T2 security chip, except the 2019 iMac that doesn't have it. This problem might be getting worse when that happens on all the other Mac models with macOS Tahoe. So we will see how the developers will tackle that problem. And for now, I am installing the macOS Tahoe developer beta on my Mac Mini M1 and give you some insights in the developer beta in the next days. And as there is still an Intel kernel, we don't have to argue about can we enable that for Intel Macs. That is a topic for next year when the first Apple Silicon only macOS will be released. And for now, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned. And a word of warning before I finish that video. Do not attempt to install macOS Tahoe with the OpenCore Legacy patcher on an unsupported Mac, because the OpenCore Legacy patcher would not recognize it, and it's not yet set up for any macOS Tahoe beta version. If you know how to do that on the GitHub repository, you can just download the source code and enable basic macOS Tahoe functionality, but I don't think the root patches will work. So give the developers some time. Don't jump on the betas. It most probably won't work. And stay tuned here on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell for notification for all other updates that are to come this week. Have a nice day. See you soon. Bye bye.